Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of the Talking Europe vlog series. This is being recorded in late September 2020 and it is the first episode that is being recorded under the auspices of the Jean Monnet Chair in Parliamentary Democracy and European Integration, which I was awarded in late August 2020. That chair will provide the context, the framework within which several events will be organized at Birkbeck in the next 3 years and beyond, with a focus on parliamentary democracy and European integration. Today's episode is focused on the EU's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the initial response, and reflects the content of a new piece of research that I have been writing over the summer. So, how did the EU react to the COVID-19 pandemic, and how can we make sense of the way in which it reacted to this pandemic and the crisis that this pandemic has created? If you look at the broader pattern of the process of European integration since at least the financial and economic crisis that started in 2008, you will see that in the relevant literature amongst those who study from the perspective of political science the process of European integration, there are two trends that have been highlighted. On the one hand, there is what is known as disintegration, and a good example in this particular case, as is often argued, is Brexit, the decision of the UK to withdraw from the European Union. More broadly, though, the concept of disintegration has been defined in ways that entail at least some of the following key points. First of all, the decision of a country to withdraw from the EU. Secondly, a reduction in the range of common or joint policies that are pursued by the EU. The dismantling of formal or actual capacity of the institutions of the EU to pursue these policies. The decision on the part of member states to withhold resources that are needed for the EU to operate, or decreasing compliance with EU legislation. On the other hand, there is another trend that has been identified notably by Eric Jones, Dan Kelleman and Sophie Meunier, who in a famous article published in 2016 have argued that the EU's response to the crisis, the financial and economic crisis post-2008, has been what they call failing forward. And failing forward basically means that EU leaders do only what is absolutely necessary to respond to the crisis, in that case financial and economic crisis, but little more than that. Although incrementally these decisions that the leaders of the member states take collectively at the level of the EU do amount to what these authors call deepening of integration, but also the other element of the point that they make is that despite deepening integration, the failing forward strategy, which is a collective strategy, entails, and I quote, incomplete, unsustainable solutions and rejecting more comprehensive reform proposals in the context of that strategy. So, is this a case of disintegration or failing forward? There are good reasons to think that, in theory at least, both concepts are relevant for our understanding of the way in which the EU has reacted or could react to this particular crisis. For example, there is no doubt that the risk of fragmentation of the single market was and remains, to a certain extent, quite significant. Economic fragmentation of the single market. Another problem is the uneven distribution of competencies, the formal powers that the EU has across the policy areas that are relevant for its reaction to the pandemic. For example, in terms of health, the EU's competencies are limited. That's what the member states wanted. In other areas like economic and monetary union or trade and so on and so forth, competition policy, they are much more developed. supranational, one can say. At the same time, there is the real problem of the uneven distribution of actual capacities of individual countries at the national level to respond to this crisis. One can mention healthcare systems, one can mention economic capabilities to provide support to companies, consumers, taxpayers, and so on and so forth, and so on. So the picture at the start of the crisis was one of potential disintegration, or at least in theory also potential failing forward. What do the preliminary evidence that we have indicate in terms of the preliminary reaction of the European Union to the crisis? In terms of health, one can say that the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control has been activated quite early on with a series of announcements and press releases indicating what its specialists, its experts knew at that point in time. At the political level, in terms of health ministers' reactions, collective reactions, decisions were made to coordinate as far as possible the response and to provide a collective response to the crisis. Now, remember, health is an area where the EU does not have developed formal competencies to act except some elements of health policy. On the contrary, in the area of the internal market, one can say that where the EU's competencies, powers, formal powers are much more developed, one can speak of an initial cacophony at the national level because individual countries took some decisions individually, for example, some border closures, some trade restrictions, crucially involving, amongst other things, personal protective equipment, the failure to enforce, at least temporary failure to enforce EU consumer rights in relation to air travel. But the picture changed from mid-March, early April, one can say, onwards, with the Commission taking a more active stance, first of all as guardian of the treaties, to remind individual countries of their responsibilities and duties under the treaties and secondary EU legislation, but also beyond this area of its powers as a guardian of the treaties, the EU, partly thanks to the Commission, has begun to create a joint response, for example, through the creation of a strategic rescue EU stockpile of medical equipment. Crucially, the suspension of the very tight Stability and Growth Pact that operates within Economic and Monetary Union in an effort to allow national expenditure increases that were necessary to keep the economies afloat. But crucially, what began to happen in late March and throughout April was the growing realization on the part of the leaders of the member states that this is far too big a crisis, and individually they could not go it alone. They could not provide a robust and successful response to this crisis individually. Now, this has been demonstrated primarily in the area of financing the economy, in the sense that another supranational institution, the European Central Bank, took the lead and announced a very robust and very flexible, unlike other programs, program of financing the economy called Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, to the tune of initially 750 billion euros. And there is no doubt that amongst economists and ECB observers, there was consensus that this was a very robust response that was necessary at that point in time. On top of that, the member states agreed quite quickly on a proposal of the European Commission to establish what became known as SURE, which is a temporary unemployment insurance scheme. But important disagreements followed as to how to proceed further in terms of financing the economy, primarily because of the reluctance of the countries that became known as frugal countries since they insisted on the actual use of the European Stability Mechanism, which is an intergovernmental arrangement outside of the remit of the EU treaties, that provides loans, and it is there to provide stabilization funds that allow individual countries to face economic crisis. However, the very robust response of those who stood to benefit from the funding was quite opposite, in the sense that, for example, the Italian Prime Minister, amongst others, said, well, these are loans, and a few years down the line you will be telling us to repay these loans. This is not the way to help us in this current crisis. Let's not forget that we did not cause this crisis. So discussions followed, and at about the beginning of May, late April, early May 2020, we reached a very important turning point, in the sense that the Franco-German proposal of May 2020 entailed major changes. In fact, it was couched in a decision made by the German political establishment to provide the kind of support that at least the members of the Eurozone and more broadly the EU needed, as a result of a realization that the provision of loans under ESM were simply not going to do the trick. The Franco-German proposals that were very ambitious were followed quickly by the European Commission's proposals. In fact, the Commission's proposals reflected to a very large extent the consensus between France and Germany, and entailed path-breaking proposals that revolved around the provision of grants as opposed to loans. First of all, that's a big change. Secondly, the mobilization of the budget of the EU as opposed to going for a standalone intergovernmental arrangement outside of the treaties, which had been done in the past. Also, these proposals involved the European Commission borrowing directly from the financial markets in a way that reflects the EU's collective AAA credit rating, so as to then part fund the EU's reaction to the economic aspects of the crisis. And one must say, as an aside, but I think it's a very pertinent point, that none of these things would have happened, possibly even Germany's stance would not have changed in the absence of Brexit. I think it's fair to say that the presence of the UK would not have allowed these proposals to come forward. However, major disagreements followed between the vast majority of member states of the EU and a small number of countries, primarily the countries that became known as frugal member states, which is a misnomer, because these countries are supposed to be net contributors to the EU's budget, but in reality they benefit enormously from their participation in the process of integration, and in particular the single market, which stood to be economically destroyed as a result of this crisis. So they put up significant resistance, and as a result of this, some of the proposals put forward by the European Commission were diluted, but it is fair to say that the essence of these proposals, and of course the Franco-German proposals, remains in place after the decision made by the European Council in mid-July 2020. The final outcome of this negotiation comes, in my view, much closer to the failing forward model that has been outlined by Jones, Kelemen and Meunier, than it does to the concept of disintegration. In fact, I can argue that there's much more of forward than of failing in this decision. In particular, I would highlight the counter-cyclical policy in economic terms that is provided through this package. the reliance primarily on grants and to a lesser extent on loans, the ECB's expanded PPP program, the SURE scheme for temporary unemployment insurance, the fact that the Commission will take joint liabilities or will act as the channel through which the EU collectively will borrow from the financial markets. Importantly, the use of the EU budget and the decision to adopt new own resources so as to wean the EU gradually away from national contributions to the extent that this is politically feasible. However, some arrangements have been criticized rightly because they are temporary, and a lot of them entail a potential for crippling, I should say, intergovernmentalism that runs the risk of undermining the next stages of the process. These are preliminary conclusions since the devil is in the detail, which no doubt the institutions of the EU and the member states collectively will encounter in the next stage, which is the implementation phase. Thank you.